The garden had once been a place of laughter, a sanctuary where love lived in the scent of roses and the rustle of leaves. But now, it was overgrown, suffocated by weeds, its colors drained as though mourning alongside its owner. Every corner of that yard whispered of loss, of silence, of a love that had been buried too soon. And in the middle of it all sat Margaret, a widow with trembling hands, staring at the earth that had once bloomed under her husband's care. To her, the soil was no longer soil, it was a graveyard of memories she could not escape. Before I take you deeper into this heart-touching story, let me pause and ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the healing power of humanity, please take a moment to like this video, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who may need it, and subscribe to our channel, I Am Kindness Corner. Together, we can keep spreading stories that remind the world that love and compassion still exist. Margaret had been married to Thomas for nearly 40 years. Together, they had built their home, raised their children, and nurtured the garden at the back of their small cottage. Thomas had a way with plants. He could coax life out of the most stubborn soil, turning dull patches of dirt into seas of color that neighbors admired. The garden was his pride, but more than that, it was their shared joy. They spent evenings there, sipping tea, talking about dreams, watching sunsets disappear behind the ivy-covered fence. But 2 years ago, Thomas's heart had stopped suddenly on a cold winter morning. Margaret had been left adrift, her world shattering in ways she could not piece back together. The children, grown and living far away, tried to support her, but grief is a solitary weight, heavy, unyielding, and intimate. Her garden, once alive, had become a reflection of her soul. Roses wilted. Vines tangled. The soil hardened. She stopped tending to it because it was too painful. Every withered petal was a reminder that Thomas wasn't there to bring it back to life. She withdrew. Neighbors noticed the once bright woman retreating behind drawn curtains. Her voice, which used to greet passers-by with warmth, grew quiet. The garden, visible to anyone walking down the lane, became a symbol of sorrow. It looked abandoned, and so did she. People whispered, offered condolences, but no one stepped forward. No one, except Daniel. Daniel was a man in his mid-30s, who had moved into the neighborhood only a year before Thomas's passing. He was quiet, the kind of neighbor who nodded politely but rarely lingered in conversation. Yet, every day as he walked his dog past Margaret's house, he saw the transformation of her garden. He noticed how neglect spread like grief, consuming what had once been beautiful. And in Margaret's eyes, when she occasionally appeared at the window, he recognized something he knew too well, loneliness. You see, Daniel had lost his wife, Anna, 5 years earlier. The pain of watching her fade from illness was something that had carved scars into him that never quite healed. For years, he had wrestled with the emptiness, the silence, the cruel rhythm of grief that made every sunrise feel meaningless. But with time, he found solace in small acts of renewal. Gardening had been one of them. Turning over soil, planting seeds, watching them grow, it had been his way of whispering to Anna, life goes on. So when he saw Margaret's garden, lifeless, struggling, forgotten, something inside him stirred. He knew that gardens, like hearts, could be coaxed back to life with patience, care, and kindness. And maybe, just maybe, he could help her find a way back too. But approaching Margaret wasn't easy. She kept to herself, her grief wrapped around her like armor. One spring morning, Daniel gathered his courage. He knocked on her door, holding a small tray of seedlings, lavender, her late husband's favorite. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in confusion. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to say, no, thank you. But something in Daniel's expression, gentle, understanding, unassuming, softened her resistance. She allowed him to place the tray on the porch. For weeks, nothing happened. The seedlings sat there, untouched, until one morning Margaret found herself watering them almost without realizing it. That single act became a spark. A week later, Daniel showed up again, this time with gloves and a spade. He didn't ask permission, he simply knelt at the edge of the garden and began pulling out weeds. Margaret watched from her window, torn between irritation and an odd sense of relief. He was invading a space that belonged to her memories, but he was also reviving something she had thought was lost forever. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the garden began to change. Daniel worked quietly, never forcing conversation, simply tending to the soil. Sometimes Margaret would join him, reluctantly at first, her hands shaking as she tugged at stubborn roots. Other times, she'd bring him a glass of water and leave it silently by his side. There was no need for words, the act of caring for the garden was its own language. As flowers began to bloom again, so did Margaret. She started stepping outside more often. The air no longer felt heavy with sorrow, it smelled of lavender and fresh soil. Memories of Thomas didn't vanish, but they no longer suffocated her. Instead, she began to feel that he was still there in the rustling leaves, in the way the roses lifted their heads to the sun. The garden became a bridge between grief and hope. One afternoon, as Margaret stood admiring the rows of daisies Daniel had planted, she felt tears roll down her cheeks, not of sadness, but of gratitude. She realized that kindness had entered her life not with grand gestures, but with patient persistence. Daniel had not tried to erase her pain, he had simply reminded her that even in loss, life could still bloom. The neighborhood began to notice the transformation too. Where once there had been whispers of pity, now there were murmurs of admiration. Children passed by and pointed at the flowers. Neighbors paused to compliment Margaret on the beauty returning to her yard. And with each word of encouragement, her spirit lifted a little higher. Daniel never sought recognition. He continued showing up, week after week, helping Margaret not just restore her garden but rediscover herself. He became more than a neighbor, he became a friend, a quiet companion in the journey of healing. They shared moments of laughter, exchanged stories of the ones they had lost, and found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their grief. The garden, once a graveyard of memories, became a symbol of resilience. Where there had been weeds, now roses thrived. Where there had been silence, now bees hummed and birds sang. And in Margaret's heart, where there had been only emptiness, gratitude and warmth began to take root. Months later, on the anniversary of Thomas's passing, Margaret invited Daniel to sit with her in the garden. They lit a candle, placed it among the flowers, and sat in silence as the sun dipped behind the fence. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel crushed by the weight of the day. She felt surrounded by life, by hope, by kindness that had entered her world when she least expected it. It was then she realized something profound: grief never truly disappears, but kindness has the power to soften its edges, to help us carry it with strength instead of despair. Dear viewers, if this story has touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness, even in small acts, can change someone's life, I ask you to please like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to I Am Kindness Corner. These stories are meant to remind us all that the world is still full of compassion and healing, even when it feels darkest. And before we close, I want to make a special request. Please take a moment to write in the comments below, kindness makes life bloom. Let's fill the space with words that inspire others to spread love and light. Margaret's garden still blooms today, not just with flowers, but with the living proof that kindness is powerful enough to bring someone back to life. And perhaps, in every blossom, there is a reminder that even when we lose the people we love, we can find pieces of them in the beauty that remains, and in the kindness of those who care enough to help us bloom again.